So today I want to talk about something that I at least partially referenced in my previous video, but I want to talk about it specifically from an evolutionary perspective, evolutionary psychological perspective, and that is this concept of context-dependent or context-driven attractiveness. And I want to get into this because it's very important for the purposes of understanding the dynamics of long-term mating strategy. A lot of the stuff these days, particularly the black pill stuff, is really tailored to and made for young men. This idea of looks maxing and really optimizing your chances to essentially get box, to get laid, maybe get a girlfriend. And there's a difference to varying degrees between so-called GF retention and GF acquisition. And this becomes more and more important as you get older. So I'd like to get out of the way the obvious stuff. Yes, looks are still probably the most important thing. You need to pass the looks test, as it were. But in addition to that, when it comes to long-term mate retention, there's some pretty profound differences between men and women. And we all know that men and women, psychologically speaking, can be quite different. Because the fundamental criterion for a man is, does she look good? And as long as she stays good-looking, tries to stay in shape, etc., there usually is no wavering in terms of attractiveness. There usually isn't any issue in terms of losing overall interest, above all, romantic interest. But when it comes to women, there are a lot of other factors. And that is where this term comes into use, context-dependent, context-driven attractiveness. Because women are more flexible. They find things attractive that men don't find attractive at all. A man, for example, could care a whit about a woman's status. It's largely irrelevant as long as she looks good. But a woman, on the other hand, can and does care about status. And so, yes, you need to pass the looks test, but there are all these other factors that go into it. And so, for example, these are minor examples, but they do occur. You have the issue of things that don't match the appearance. So sometimes you might have an individual who looks really good, but the voice is a squeaky voice or just is not very good and doesn't match the appearance. Or you can have the opposite, somebody with a really good voice but doesn't look very good, and everything in between. Or you could imagine, for example, some theoretical example, of course, and it's unlikely this would be true, but some guy who's very tall and good-looking, Chad Light Chad, but has some bizarre, absurd phobia when it comes to spiders and cockroaches and mice. And he sees a mouse and he screams like a girl, and this happens more than once, and his girlfriend, of course, loses interest in him because that's regarded as a effeminate female characteristic to be afraid of creepy crawlies, that sort of thing. Absurd example, I grant you, but there are a number of factors that can affect that. Loss of income, this has been shown in studies, affects romantic attraction on the part of women towards men. And sometimes they're personality deficiencies. So, for example, a friend of mine who passed away by his own hand, mind you, in mid-2017, was a tall, good-looking guy who was exceptionally smart. He was getting a PhD in genetics, had an undergraduate degree in neuroscience from a pretty prestigious university, etc. But he was an extremely neurotic individual, very depressed, abused alcohol, and ultimately that led to dissolution of various relationships he had, and most unfortunately, the dissolution of his own life. And so there are variables when considering long-term partnership that are almost never discussed in so-called black pill lookism circles. Yes, you need the appearance, and what comes after that. That's the whole reason why you get people who will talk about game, because ultimately what I'm talking about are all the factors, the ingredients that go into so-called female attraction, assuming you pass the looks test, obviously. Those things are called fecal matter tests. And these fecal matter tests come very naturally. And they're testing to see if you're quote-unquote worthy, obviously. So, in the example I gave, the very insane, unlikely example of some tall, good-looking Chad who's terrified of mice and cockroaches, that could be viewed as a kind of fecal matter test because if he jumps or screams or whatever, that would be a demotion in status. Likewise, if he were a total bum, decided to never work, yada, 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 that could be a demotion in status. Or more specifically, if you wanted to measure out a fecal matter test, he loses his job, and how much time does it take him to acquire a new job? When is he back on his feet? Some women will tolerate more time than others. Some women won't tolerate any time. But the point I'm trying to drive home here, and I thought I drove home decently well in the previous video, is quite simply that attraction, yes, has everything to do with looks, but with women there are other factors. And there are studies that cite this. For example, there was a woman who went to a conference of sorts, and she initially was very attracted to the guy who was organizing the conference and was basically the head of the conference. Why? Status. Afterwards, when he lost that status and was no longer the head of the conference, she lost interest in him. And so it goes. Essentially, even if you pass all the initial tests, including the looks test, you are still going to face a series, a battery of fecal matter tests that you may or may not pass. And most people, as I've said, most men will eventually falter, because what we're really talking about is a masquerade. And if it's not a masquerade, then I guess you're a perfect human being. You never have to worry about any of this, because you'll always maintain frame, you'll look perfectly good, you have the perfect income, etc., etc. That, of course, is exceedingly rare. I think we can all acknowledge that. And so some of this stuff involves carrying out a masquerade for the sake of maintaining a relationship. And this is, again, something that the black pill, lookism crowd totally misses out on. They really think that for long-term success, especially as you get older, that the only thing that matters is looks. Maybe a bit of personality, maybe a bit of money. And once you have the looks, it's just cruise control. Everything else just becomes irrelevant. But again, the evidence doesn't bear that out. There are tons of examples of women losing interest due to things other than looks. And that is because women obviously care about looks, but they also care about status. They also care about, quote unquote, maintaining frame, not showing off any effeminate qualities, and even such things as fellow female vetting. This has been proven too in studies, that a man who has several women vouching for him, even if an individual woman doesn't find that man attractive, will rather suddenly or not so suddenly find that man attractive and have an interest in him, because the women who have regarded him as attractive are acting as vetting mechanisms for the other woman. And this is why, to my mind, even if you pass all the looks tests, you look really good, there's going to be some other factor, because I'm going to assume you're not going to be perfect and you have some flaw, that will lead potentially to the dissolution of the relationship. And you will have to go through hoops. You will have to go through these hoops of the fecal matter test. And that is what, quote unquote, maintaining frame and game ultimately is about. The looks stuff, looks maxing, that might, depending on your genes and your luck, that might garner you some interest, might help you acquire some kind of GF initially. But after that, after you fulfill the prerequisites of looks, obviously, other things become important, and you need to maintain that quote-unquote frame. If you are a good-looking tall guy who's extremely depressive and neurotic, good luck with that. Now, it is true that some women will show quote-unquote more sympathy for guys like that just because of their looks, and that's possible, but that only has so much leniency, and that only has so much wriggle room. Eventually, women will get tired of what they regard as weakness in men. And this is something that's unavoidable. And given how stringent the requirements of women are these days in relationships, you could argue that almost no man can navigate them without, quote-unquote, screwing up, leading to the dissolution of the relationship, which begs the question, why bother? Well, you could argue for the sake of box, okay. You could argue for the sake of this or that. But I guarantee you, beyond the black pill, beyond the looks maxing, exists this other world of mate retention, and it's not as simple as just you need to look good and that's it. Of course you need to look good, and then there is this battery of other junk that needs to accompany it, and maybe you fulfill most of it, maybe you don't. But eventually, you will make mistakes, you will screw up, and most women these days are not very forgiving of that, and she will drop you like a bad habit. So if you want to pursue that, if you think it's feasible, by all means, go for it. But know the reality is almost invariably going to be something that lacks substance, and you will be fighting tooth and nail in various ways to maintain it, assuming you pass the looks part, which is, of course, incredibly important. And as I said in the beginning, that is very, very different with all these variables for men. If you're a guy, if she looks good and stays good looking, that's more than enough typically. And with women, well, different creatures entirely. So, good luck with that. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell icon to be informed of my videos. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Everyone take care. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.